Modern single-shot rifles. That's what we're going to talk about today on Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we talk about guns, gunfighting tactics, different platforms, the right way, with God Almighty at the center, biblical Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. Military, law enforcement, private security, contracting, hunting, background, bio, bullet points in the show notes. Blessed be the Lord my rock, who trains my hands for war and fingers for battle. Okay, let's get into this. Single-shot center-fire rifles of modern design. And what I mean by that is I'm not talking about really old single shots or reproductions like an Italian reproduction of an old Western single shot rifle. I'm talking about fairly modern designs of single shot rifles. And modern is a loose term I'm using here, but let's say from the 1900s or later. What got me thinking about this was an episode I recorded recently on the H&R handy rifle, a mainstay if you grew up in the 90s. You know, the NEF and H&R handy rifles and single-shot shotguns. There are a lot of other designs out there. I got to thinking about those, and I mentioned some in the podcast, but I thought, a brief mention is probably not enough. So I thought I would go through them, talk about them, why you may want a single shot. With all the things today, with the really affordable AR-15s, a lot of these are quite expensive guns, right? When you can get an AR-15 and an AR-10, when you can get a good bolt action for cheaper than a lot of these, or the same price as a lot of these. Why? Why would anybody do this? Well, let's tackle that first, then we'll get into some of the modern platforms. I think probably the overarching philosophy we should talk about. Not everything is about, volume of fire, right? Not everything is about let's just spray and pray and dump as many rounds as possible. Not everything is about a mag dump on Instagram with a suppressor to look cool. So I love high-speed competitions. I love Steel Challenge, right? I love shooting fast sometimes, but I also love getting back to the basics. I have a single shot that I use when I just want to slow down, focus on the fundamentals, make this shot count. That is massively appealing to me and probably many others when you're like, I have this one shot and then I have to reload, right? Single shots are not like, that's kind of a bad name. It should be like slower reloading rifles, because a single shot rifle would be like something like a Liberator, like you shoot it once and then you throw it away, right? You don't shoot it once and then throw it away. It's not like you shoot it once and then it's garbage. You just have to shoot it once and then generally break it open or do some mechanism and reload it by putting a manual loading a round in the chamber. But the fact that you have to do that, the fact that you have to manually load the next round in, means that you're probably going to take more time on your shot that you have in the chamber. Let's just say you have two rifles, and one is a Ruger 1022. Fantastic, great all-around 1022. I do a ton of practice and a ton of shooting and hunting with a Ruger 1022. It's like the Ruger 1020. Ruger 1022 is like the 22 long rifle, practical rifle to beat in our time. Let's say you have a couple hours to go out to a range, and you have a Ruger 1022, and you have a single shot 22 rifle. You're going to do vastly different practice, probably, with both those. Likely you're going to do more emphasis on the fundamentals and marksmanship and making that shot count, paying more attention to what you're doing with the single shot. I could be wrong, but just in general, I think that's probably more likely. That has an appeal to it. Another main appeal to these is for hunting, and I love hunting. I don't apologize for that. I love, slaying a beast and putting meat on the table for myself and my family. Good, high-quality nutrition for my wife and myself. That's fantastic. I don't apologize for that, and you shouldn't either. But hunting, challenging yourself. Now, none of these are going to be a more practical choice in general than a good bolt-action hunting rifle. Or, if you're a lever-action guy or whatever, that's fine. But, speaking from a practical standpoint, these are not going to be any more practical, really. They do offer a few advantages, which I'll get to, but in reality, they don't offer a lot of advantage and quite a few drawbacks. But, again, getting back to that one shot, like you want to challenge yourself. I love challenging myself by handgun hunting, even if it's not a specific handgun season, because those are really rare. Like I've killed quite a few animals and more deer than I can remember with a handgun because it's harder, because I like the challenge, right? And because just opportunity. So I totally get that, the challenging oneself. You could do that with a single shot. If you're a rifleman, you're like, I want to focus on this one shot. I'm going to wait a little bit longer for a really good shot with this single shot than maybe I would otherwise. That is a major draw of the single shot rifle. All right, let's talk about some of the other ones. You want to limit somebody else. It's somebody else's first rifle. You're starting a young man or young woman, or an old man or old woman for that matter. You're getting somebody started in shooting, and you want them to focus on the fundamentals. You want them to not just get into the habit of spraying and praying and dumping a brick of ammo. You want them to focus on making that one shot count. So you start them off with a single shot. That is a good method. Now, a brief aside here, I'm not including any single shot bolt actions in this list today, but you certainly can do that. You certainly can make just about any bolt action rifle a single shot by just putting a magazine block in there. They even make those for AR-15s, right? When I shoot service rifle competitions, one of those stages is single loading. You single load the rounds, even though it's a semi-automatic, right? So you can do that on your own. You can put a loading block in an AR-15. You can do it in a bolt action. There are a lot of single-shot bolt actions. That's not really what we're talking about today, right? And if you wanted to challenge yourself and you had a bolt action, you could just, take out the magazine and have the one round. Do kind of the same thing. But that's not what we're talking about today. So you could challenge yourself that way. They'd make single round magazines for Ruger 1022. So if you have a 1022 and you want to focus on that, buy a single round magazine. So there's that. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about dedicated, designed as single shot rifles. So you're getting somebody else started and you want them to really focus and slow down and focus on the fundamentals. Also, a lot of these, not all of them, but a lot of these we're going to talk about are hammered, break open, BOSS for, an acronym, break open single shots with a hammer. Not all, but a lot of them, which makes it really easy for you as far as safety when you're teaching a new shooter. Like they shot the one shot, they're not going to get all excited and turn around on you with a loaded gun by definition because they only have one shot. That's a big one. Especially if you have kind of a spastic kid, right, that you're trying to train. And I've done a lot of firearms instruction in some of my favorite classes. You'd think with all my background and an F.B.I. instructor and all this, my favorite classes are like super tactical backflip John Wick classes. But they're not. They're teaching a brand new shooter, a lot of times kids. Those are some of my favorite classes to teach. So if you got a particularly spastic kid, right, a gun with a hammer and a single shot that you can look and see the gun is ready to fire or it's not ready to fire, and you haven't given them the command to fire, then you know that they're doing something wrong. And after they fired that shot, right, if they go a little bit spastic, get all excited and try to turn around and the gun goes with them, it's still a big deal, but it's not nearly as big a deal as if it's a semi-auto, right? So that's got a big appeal to it. Now for any shooter, these can be fairly short compared to another rifle with a similar barrel length because you don't have the action. If you think about a semi-auto or a bolt action or pretty much anything other than a break-open single shot or like a falling block design, you're going to have the entire length of the action, which is several inches generally on a centerfire rifle. So if you took, let's say 22 inches is a good middle of the road for like a centerfire rifle, 30-06, 308, 270. You can get longer, you can get shorter, obviously. But let's just say you have that. If you put both those rifles next to each other, like you put the buttstocks on the ground and line them up on the side of your truck, the single shot's going to be way shorter. May not necessarily be lighter, because a lot of these are not lightweight designs, but it might be shorter. That's an advantage. Or potentially an advantage, depending on your terrain. They're also pretty simple to understand and operate. Now, they're not super simple as far as number of parts and machinery goes. I think that's one of the misconceptions of like lever actions and single shots. Like, ooh, they're simple. They're simple to operate. That doesn't mean that they're simple machines inside. A simple bolt-action rifle is about as simple a repeating firearm as you can get, or a pump-action shotgun, right? Those are about as simple as you can make a repeating firearm. These single shots, a lot of them are going to be as or more complicated than that. So, but as far as you and understanding them, like, you just want the simplicity of, you break open the action, you put a round in, you shut the action, right? Like, it's pretty simple. So there is that simplicity, I think, that is a real advantage, or if, at least not if an advantage, it's a real kind of mystique to it. There's a real romance to that simplicity of operation. So there's that maybe advantage. Maybe advantage is not the right word, but you get what I'm trying to say, I hope. Now let's talk about some of the disadvantages. Pretty much none of these that I can think of are going to have a free-floated barrel. So there's that. That potentially can cause accuracy issues. Since you are touching something that's touching the barrel, you could potentially change point of aim, point of impact. There are going to be a lot of exceptions to this, but in general, you line up a bunch of single-shot rifles and a bunch of bolt actions, they're probably not going to be as accurate. I'm just saying. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't have or you can't make an exceptionally accurate single-shot rifle. Now, just because they're shorter also doesn't mean they're going to be lighter. You can get a really light bolt-action rifle. Like, I have a Kimber Adirondack that I love that I used when I was guiding, professionally guiding. I don't professionally guide anymore at this time. Maybe I will in the future. But it was their main go-to rifle. One, because I was focused on the client, and that rifle weighed under 5 pounds. It weighed like 4 pounds and something. And it's a modern center-fire rifle. Repeatable. It's a great rifle. It weighs under 5 pounds. I don't think any on the list today are going to be lighter than that. I could be wrong. But so they're probably not going to be lighter than you could get a bolt-action rifle. So that's not really an advantage there either. And we talked about the not free-floated. And obviously, the big disadvantage is rate of fire, right? These are slow they're single-shot rifles. They are manual reloading, like manually taking a round out, or if it has, an ejector, manually putting the round in the chamber. It's much slower of a process. It's not slow like a muzzle loader, right? It's not slow like an old Brown Bess musket, or a blunderbuss, but it's a giant leap forward compared to that. But it's a fairly slow process compared to even a bolt-action rifle, which is slower than a lever-action rifle, which is slower than a pump-action rifle, which is slower than a semi-auto. So going down the line of slow to reload, these single shots are slow to reload. Now, consider the application, right? If that is kind of also part of the appeal. So a big appeal, part of a giant disadvantage. I'm not telling you to grab one of these for the apocalypse. I'm not telling you to use one of these as your dangerous game rifle. I'm not telling you to go to coastal Alaska. And I lived in coastal Alaska. I'm not telling you to go there and bring this as your one rifle. Like, it's not what I'm saying. Because of the coastal brown bears, right, and black bears and a bunch of other stuff. But I'm not telling you that, right, but the application. So that's a major draw and a major disadvantage. They're slow to reload. Okay, that's probably way more of a preamble than I was thinking of, but just thinking out loud here with you guys. Let's get to the list. I already talked about the H&R Handy Rifle, a mainstay of the 90s. Available in some pretty common calibers and some pretty obscure calibers. Pretty much anything that was around in the 90s or into the 2000s you're likely to find in these. 223, 22 Hornet, all the way up to 4570, 500 Smith & Wesson, and a bunch of stuff in between. And they're available in some different models. but super simple. They're not super affordable now, which I talked about. If you're really specific on that one, go listen to that episode on the H&R Handy Rifle. They were super affordable at the time. They're not super affordable anymore. There's that. The H&R Handy Rifle. Probably the most similar ones that I can think of available today are going to be the Rossis. Rossi makes some single-shot rifles. They make them in 223 or 5.56. They make them in 300 Blackout. I think they make them in 45 Colt, which is pretty cool. Very affordable by today's standards, especially if you adjust the H&R Handy Rifle prices from the 90s with inflation, and I mean actual inflation, not whatever the inflation number is said to be, but what it actually is. They're pretty affordable, the Rossis. They're not made in Turkey. They're not some cheap Turkish trash. I didn't include any cheap Turkish trash in today's episode. All right, they're not made in America, but they're not made in Turkey either by a bunch of Muslims that want to kill you, cut your head off, and take your women. They're made in a Christian nation, a Christian country. The Rossis, I've actually been pleasantly surprised in the past with some Rossi stuff. Or Puma, whatever they were before Rossi. But the Rossi rifles, they may make some other calibers, but I know that they make those. Another one, very similar, although more expensive. I don't know that they're any better in quality. I'm going to be honest. I have thus far been much less than impressed with N.R.A. rifle quality. I know. It's going to make a lot of people mad, but I'm just telling you. But N.R.A, they make a single shot. They make a single shot in one of my favorite deer calibers, 243. So I give them a point up for that. They make a bunch of other calibers. I think they make 308, 243. They have a whole list of calibers, but that one, it's a little bit different because it's got more of a, if you're familiar with like a fine double gun and a shotgun, they have that same kind of lever to unlock the action. Still a break open single shot, but kind of a different opening mechanism. I don't know that it's any better or any worse than an H&R Handy Rifle or a Rossi. It's just different. But that one is American made. They're not cheap. Again, these ones are quite a bit, I think, more expensive, and they are going to be, you could get a good bolt-action rifle, even a good American bolt-action rifle for what some of these are going to cost, the N.R.As. So there's those. There's also a bit of a different design, still a break-open single shot, and I think these are probably a step up in quality, although not a step up in price, and that's going to be the CVAs. CVA makes a line of single-shot rifles. They make them in some really cool calibers, like 35 Whelen. If you're hunting big game with a single shot and you only get one shot, right, why not make it a 35 Whelen? I wouldn't recommend that for a youth gun, for a first gun, but right, if you have always just wanted a 35 Whelen and have never had one, you could get one for a decent price in the CVA. Now, CVA was around for a long time in the muzzleloading world, but from all accounts, they make a good rifle. I kind of consider CVA, whether fairly or unfair, like the budget version of a Bagara, which I also consider kind of a budget rifle. But the CVAs, they're decent quality from everything that I know. I've never personally owned one. But the CVAs, they make a line of single-shot rifles. They make quite a few calibers. You might want to check those out if you're interested in this. Again, this is not meant to be an in-depth one on each individual line. I did one on the H&R. I don't know that I'll do one on these other ones. I guess if we're going up in price gradually, kind of, the Thompson Center, Contenders, and Encores. These were some of my favorite guns growing up. I never owned one. These were kind of like the rich man single shot. And I was hunting with a break-open shotgun, right? Break-open, New England firearm shotgun. So these were a little bit, hoity-toity for me, but I always thought they were beautiful and really cool, and I still think they're some of the most beautiful single shots, period. There's one that I think that is more elegant, which I'll talk about later, but the Thompson Center Encores and the Contenders. Now, I'm blessed to have a Contender, but always thought the Contender was, because the Contender is the smaller of the two, right? The Contender, those calibers stop just shy of 308. But the Contender, I think, is one of the most beautiful firearms ever made, just period, single shot or otherwise. It's beautiful. And the H&Rs, they made different barrels, but you were supposed to send those in the factory because the tolerances were not tight enough that you could just swap barrels. Now, some people have, and they still have all their fingers. I'm not telling you should do it, but they weren't designed for that. The Thompson Center, Contenders, and Encores, they were such fine rifles and pistols that, and mine's actually a pistol. It's either or, right? You can switch it back and forth, but I have it as a pistol to focus on my pistol fundamentals. However, where was I going with that? These were made to such a fine quality that you could just buy random barrels. You still can. You could buy a barrel on eBay, right, and get it. I think eBay sells barrels. You get my point. You know, at a local gun store that has one used. You can get a barrel, and you can put it on your Thompson Center. Any caliber that's interchangeable with it. And Encore is like the bigger calibers. If you want, you know, much bigger calibers, you can swap those out. They have kind of a different mechanism. You pull down on the trigger guard. The trigger guard kind of pulls, and it opens the gun up. They have a hammer. And again, I think they are gorgeous. They're pretty modular, which you generally don't think about modularity with a single shot, but you can like change the stocks out, change the forends out. You can go from a pistol to a rifle. And there was something back in the day that's not an NFA, you know, issue. I don't think anybody's ever robbed a bank with a Thompson Center Contender. I could be wrong. They also make some pretty cool calibers now. I'm not going to go through all the calibers, but like 44 Magnum and a handgun or a rifle, 45 Colts. They made some that will fire both 410 and, you know, or 45 and 410. A whole slew of calibers, even some weird ones you probably aren't familiar with unless you're really a gunner, like the 730 Waters. Really cool cartridge, kind of popular. More popular in this platform than probably many others, right? But some real cool obscure calibers. A lot of wildcatters like them because they're easier to ream out. A lot of calibers were made in the Thompson Center. Now, that company went out for a while, and they did come back. They're currently only making the Encore. They're right around $1,000 I saw today. Midway USA, not a sponsor or anything, but I've used Midway so long that my login is my old badge number from L.A.P.D. Like my old badge number is my whatever they call it, code or whatever. And that's so old that was, you know, grandfathered in probably from when you didn't need letters and numbers and all the other stuff, like the early days of the internet. So I've used Midway a long time. They're not a sponsor. I don't take sponsors on the show unless you want to contribute on Patreon, because I don't want to, you know, show favoritism to any gun or ammo company, and you shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of the righteous. So consider becoming a patron. Anyway, when I checked today, you could still get an Encore right around $1,000. Again, these are not cheap. You could get a lot of really good bolt-action rifles for that price. But you're probably not getting it for that, right? You're getting it because, one, they're beautiful, and two, you want the things we talked about with the single shot. But the Thompson Center Contenders and Encores, those are around. Oh, these also can come in stainless, which I think is great. The old H&Rs, I don't know that I've ever seen one in stainless. Maybe I have, but I think they came in stainless. At least I saw that when I was researching them. But in stainless, that's pretty cool. Now, what I think is this is tied with what I think is the most beautiful weapon rifle ever made, period. And that's going to be a Ruger number 1. A Ruger number 1 International Stainless. International or RSI just means that the stock goes all the way to the end of the barrel. Now, these have their advantages and disadvantages, but the Ruger number 1s, I think the only other rivals of this would be the international stocked Ruger 77, which is the bolt action. I don't think one's more or less beautiful than the other. Let's call it a tie. Some people might think the single shots are prettier, but the Ruger number 1 RS, specifically RSI International Stainless Steel. I'm a sucker for stainless steel. Maybe it's because you grew up in the South on the coast where you just look at something long enough and it seemed like it would rust. But I also think like the wood and stainless steel look is just beautiful aesthetically. Some people love blued. I like stainless. Like a stainless and a wood stock to me just look beautiful. Anyway, aesthetically, one of the most beautiful guns ever made by human hands. The Ruger number 1. They also make a number 3. I'm going to be honest. I am not the aficionado of these has never owned one, they're really expensive. You're probably talking, several $1,000s. And Ruger's kind of famous for this, coming back out with like a falling block single shot. There are other companies that make them. I think right now Park West Arms makes one, and those are way, way expensive. They're like, vehicle expensive. But the Ruger number 1 and number 3s, I'm not super familiar with the difference between a number 1 and a number 3. I don't think they make the number 3 anymore. However, these are like a falling block design. So the ones we've talked about heretofore break open, kind of like you're familiar with a shotgun probably. These are different. These have a giant falling block. They're a very strong action. From what I hear, they're not an inherently very accurate action, but they are very strong. They can be had in some really teeny tiny calibers, like really small calibers, up into big beastie calibers, up into like big dangerous game calibers. The action will handle it. They have a lever different, but kind of a similar place to the Thompson centers, where it's like the trigger guard, like you push that down, and then instead of the gun breaking open, the block falls and you load in a cartridge. It's kind of cool, kind of mechanically interesting. So there's that. Again, they're beautiful guns. And they've come out with they generally do like limited runs of different calibers, anything from like 6.5 by 55, 7 by 57, 4570. They've had some really cool calibers over the years. So you want to, drop a bunch of money on Gunbroker, you can likely find one in a caliber you're interested in. They make, again, the RSI that I talked about. They've made the Tropical, I believe, which is kind of a really pretty one. They even make some without iron sights, which makes me sad, but they don't all have iron sights. But the Ruger number 3s and the number 1s, those are a thing. And again, unless you get into the really high semi-customs like a Park West Arm, formerly Dakota, that's pretty much the ones that I know of. Let me go back and check my list that I texted myself to make sure I didn't forget any. Hey guys, if you notice a change in the audio, some background noise, because I'm recording this on a back road, because I'm really bad at trying to promote myself, right? Promote the podcast. I'm not a great marketer. I know that, right? That's okay. I recorded 2 episodes like this, one on pump action rifles and one on semi-automatic, like non-battle rifles, like semi-automatic hunting rifles and crossover rifles. If today's episode interests you, or those might interest you, those are on Patreon, and that's just a small sample of a bunch of stuff that's on Patreon. There is a lot of content that's only on Patreon, so there should be a link in the show notes. Consider becoming a patron. With that, thanks for listening, and I hope to see you on Patreon. No, in fact, I believe that is it. I think of the modern ones that I know of, right, those are the modern design single-shot rifles. Right, if you're probably looking for something else if you're going to get like a Quigley gun, a 45 110, or like a Martini Henry or something like that, right? That's probably because you're into the historicity. These are modern designed single-shot rifles. And center fires. There's many rimfire single shots, but center fire modern single shot center fire rifles. Yeah, those are the ones at least that I could think of today. There may be one that I'm forgetting or leaving out. My tactical tip of the day is going to surprise a lot of people because I dunk on suppressors a lot because I think they're not always, but usually just a marketing gimmick. Like they're a way to get you to spend $1,000 on a cheap metal tube that probably costs $20 to $30 to make, because I can make one for cheaper than that. I know how suppressors work. They're a super simple machine, and the fact that they get people to dump $1,000 or more kind of makes me sad. And most of the time, I think they're pretty much useless, but not all the time. So, getting into today's tactical tip, there are use cases for suppressors. Like, it's totally legal for you to shoot, but you want to be a good neighbor and you don't want to be super loud. You want to shoot gophers in the backyard, and you want to spend $1,000 on a suppressor to do that, or a slightly cheaper suppressor. right? So there are use cases for suppressors. I'm not saying they're totally useless. I'm saying they're mostly useless. But anyway, getting back to this, there are use cases for suppressors. If you want a very quiet gun, right, because a semi-auto, well, if you go supersonic, that negates a lot of the point of a suppressor anyway, because supersonic crack happens outside of the suppressor. So the gun's still not hearing safe even if you suppress it. So you just spend $1,000 to look cool on Instagram. But if you go subsonic, you can get pretty quiet. You can do that with a lot of these calibers we talked about today. 45 Colt, you load heavy for caliber, slow bullets, 38 Special 357 Magnum, and a lot of these heavy for caliber bullets, slow under 1,000 feet a second. I know that's not the exact speed of sound, and that depends on air pressure and density and altitude and a bunch of stuff. But just it's a rough number that's easy to remember. You just load it under that, pretty quiet. They also, again, we talked about Rossi. They make one of these in 300 Blackout. A big appeal of that cartridge is the subsonic loads. One of these single shots with a suppressor or without a suppressor with a longer barrel can be very, very quiet. So there are use cases for that. If you want to learn how to shoot quiet without a suppressor, I did a whole episode on that you can look up. Totally legally, totally without all the rigmarole of a suppressor. You don't need a suppressor to be quiet shooting, a modern cartridge. So anyway, these single shots can be useful for that, especially because you're not requiring the energy of the round to cycle like you would in a semi-auto, and they can be pretty quiet. And you don't have the noise of the action moving back and forth and like you would on a semi-auto, even if you were shooting subsonics. So that's your tactical tip of the day, your tactical verse of the day. You shall not put the Lord your God to the test. You shall not put the Lord your God to the test. Now, my comments on this. We had a pretty good intellectual debate today, I thought, in our chat for the podcast, with several of the patrons in there, seeing that, and it was a debate on at what point. My thing was, at what point is your lack or refusal to prepare yourself, let's just say for adversity, at what point is that like negligence? Right, when Jesus is led away into the wilderness for 40 days, and one of the things Satan tempts him with is, just do this and God will protect you. And he comes back with, you shall not tempt the Lord your God. It is written, you shall not tempt the Lord your God, or you shall not put the Lord your God to the test, depending on your translation. Right, Jesus quotes Scripture at him because Jesus is the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. A whole other thing we could talk about, but that this is not a sermon. But when Jesus is tempted by the devil, he comes back with Scripture several times, 3 times. He comes back with Scripture. So when you're tempted by the devil, what should you probably do? Jesus is our example. You should probably have some Scripture memorized. You should probably be able to come back at that temptation with Scripture. Anyway, with that, I appreciate you guys. I appreciate all that you do. Thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.